Hi, my name's Mark. I'm one of the pastors here at Trillium. This week we're looking at that moment just after Pentecost when Peter stands before a group of Jews in Jerusalem and begins to proclaim the mission of Jesus in terms of the Joel prophecy. Today I'm not so much interested in the specifics of the Joel prophecy, but just in that transformation from Jesus to those first disciples. That's the pivotal moment when the church becomes awakened, when that community gathered around Jesus becomes its own reality. That moment in Pentecost, which we looked at a week ago, when the Holy Spirit comes upon the disciples, is that moment when Jesus disappears on the outside and comes to live on the inside of the disciples. He goes from being a star to being the supporting actor in their lives. And something happens big, a transformation occurs that is life-changing. It's world-changing. In fact, the church today exists because of this transforming moment. Last week, we also looked at Kahlil Gibran's famous poem on children. And we looked at this one little quotation from it. It says this: "For life goes not backward, nor tarries with yesterday. You are the bows from which your children as living arrows are sent forth. The archer sees the mark upon the path of the infinite, and he bends you with his might that his arrows may go swift and far. Let your bending in the archer's hand be for gladness, for even as he loves the arrow that flies, so he loves also the bow that is stable." The analogy, I think, works for Jesus and those first disciples. Jesus, who was the arrow sent into the world by God as life's longing for itself, now becomes the bow. And the great archer now draws back those arrows who we know as the disciples, and he sends them forth out into life in new ways, and the multiplication of the Christ from one to many has occurred. Life moves forward through those disciples, and they become, in a sense, like Jesus, the embodiment of God's ways into the world. And you can see it in Peter's speech before that crowd of Jews. We're born into the world as arrows. As children, we're born into the world as arrows, according to Kahlil Gibran. And arrows are so simple and pure. Their design is so simple and pure. And it's so easy for us to want to stay as arrows. We want to stay as arrows and be the center of attention. We want to be the focus of attention. You know, as I was thinking about this, I was reminded of a movie as a kid that I really loved, and even as an adult, I really enjoy, called The Adventures of Robin Hood with Errol Flynn. If you've had a chance to see it, you'll know what I'm talking about. If you haven't seen it, I'd really invite you to go and either rent the movie or get it off Netflix, or you can pick it up fairly cheaply at a HMV or a like store. And there's that moment in the movie, in the archery display in a competition that had been set up to determine who was the greatest archer in England. And there, of course, Robin Hood shows up. And there's that one little scene, and I'll give you a chance to watch it right here now, and then I'll come back and talk to you about it. And you've seen the scene, and you see that focus, the drama's on the arrow. The arrow is the focus, on the target, the arrow is the focus. The archers, they're not that important. The bow is almost a non-event. The whole drama of the scene is focused on the arrow and its flight to the target. And you see the first arrow hit the middle of the bullseye, and then all of a sudden there's Robin Hood with a great task ahead of him, and yet he sends forth the arrow, and we see it going right down the shaft of the other arrow, and he wins the competition. See, that's the drama of being an arrow, and it's something that we as children and even as adults, we love to be at the center of the drama, but at some point along the way, we are called to let that way of the arrow go and become a bow. See, a bow is complex. It's made of many parts. It has to be both flexible and strong. It has to have a certain grace to it. It has to be able to hold tension. It has to be able to release without effort. God calls us, as we grow in life, to become bows that we can launch forth the life of others into the world. We're no longer the center of attention, and yet we are so important to the plans of God and the way that human beings are meant to live with each other. As bows, we get to now be the instrument by which life in others gets to move forward. And this sacred task is something that I see happening right at the very beginning of the church, when Peter and those first disciples are sent forth out into the life as arrows. But you know, it's not very long before Peter and the other apostles and Paul and other unnamed disciples become themselves bows. I think Peter at some point becomes a bow. Paul certainly becomes a bow, even as he's sent out initially into the world as an arrow to bring the gospel of love to the Gentiles. At some point along the way, after planting all these churches and nurturing these disciples, he becomes a bow. In a sense, life is paid forward through him to people like Timothy and Sosthenes and other important next generation disciples. And it's true for the church today that our great sacred task is to go from being arrows where we're the focus of the life and then now become the bow where we push or extend life through us into the future. I think that one of the great crises of the church today is that we have committed ourselves to the way of the arrow. We want to hold on to life, and we have not allowed the transformation from arrow into bow for our own sake. I see that the great call of God in the church today is to understand exactly how life is moved forward. It's not moved forward by the arrow propelling itself. It's moved forward when people understand that they are both arrow and bow at some point along the journey. See, that's what family's about. That's what Kahlil Gibran was trying to get at. At some point we're children, but then we become adults, we become parents, and we're meant now to become the bow, no longer the arrow, the bow that sends forth life. And Kahlil Gibran wasn't just talking about biology, he was talking in a spiritual sense too. We can be spiritual parents, we can be spiritual children for people, we can be life in an arrow sense, but we can also be the continuer of life in the bow sense. How about you and I giving up the arrow ways for ourselves if we're called to that and allowing God to transform us into bows so that we are no longer the focus of life, but we are the means by which life is parlayed forward into the future. And I think when we do that, we come close to that first generation of the church from Jesus to those first disciples, when the transformation in Jesus' life went from arrow to bow, and we watch now a next generation of followers becoming himself in the world, Jesus in the world. That's true for 2,000 years ago, it's true for today. Become the bow. Let God pull you back with all the power of heaven itself to launch forth life through others. Until then, until next week at least, until we have a chance to chat further about this, God be with you.